Do you ever have one of those moments where you're in a conversation with somebody and you're being vulnerable, you're telling them a little bit about your story, and they stop you with something like, wow, that's interesting. You would have thought you would have known better because, yeah, you probably should have known better. You were an adult. You had been through something like this before. I mean, most of us have a case of the I know betters. I've talked about this in our podcast before, but it stops you. It shuts you down in a way. Has that ever happened to you in a conversation? And honestly, it'll shut down that friend from being somebody that you can even talk to about any vulnerable subject, possibly again. And sometimes it's not in that kind of a context. Sometimes it's even when you're talking with somebody professionally and they cut you off and say, gosh, I would have thought you would have known more given that you've worked here for such and such amount of time. There's a lot of ways in which this little comes up, and it happened to me recently. So I wanted to talk about it with you today. So if ever this has happened to you or you're kind of worried about it happening to you, keep listening. Welcome. This is Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving, a podcast that teaches women in midlife to unapologetically stop silencing their dreams and start designing the lives they want to live in. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie, and as a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a twice-divorced single mother myself, I not only know how hard it can feel heading into midlife, I am living it right here with you. I have taken all the many failed attempts and lessons learned in my own life and combine it with my extensive clinical experience to give you the tools you need to make midlife the best time in your life. No joke. So let's get started.
Are you on my mailing list yet? Because if you're not, you really should be. You want to join at learntoloveyourstory.com. If you scroll down, I'm giving away a freebie for you. Honestly, you know what it is? A free course. I sell online courses, but this is a course just for you. And it's about freeing yourself, letting go of what others' expectations and ideas are for you. That nagging self-doubt in your head, it's usually fueled by your consideration of what others think of you over your consideration of what you think of you. And so I teach you in my video all about what is underlying that kind of self-doubt and how to get out of that conundrum. And I give you a workbook that goes with it that helps you to build the skill sets that you're going to need for that. So please make sure you're on my mailing list, because at the least, you're going to get a free gift. And at the most, you're going to hear about all the things that we're doing on Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving and learntoloveyourstory.com. And you don't want to be missing out on any of the new things that'll be coming your way. Welcome back, everybody, to Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving. This is a podcast where we are trying to debunk all of the stuff that you've heard about what midlife crisis looks like, because it never looks like that for women. And we're trying to help women to feel empowered and to feel like they have the resources and resiliency to make it through in a centered way, in a way that makes you want to get up in the morning, right? So that's what this podcast is all about. And when I recently had this experience happen to me where I felt shut down, I just figured I would share it with my listenership, because I am sure one of you, at least one of you out there, has had a similar experience or will have a similar experience. And I wanted to kind of walk you through, because this has happened to me on more than one occasion, right? The case of the I know betters, but it isn't even just a case of the I know betters. It's when somebody else reflects that to you, kind of points out to you, well, don't you think you should have known better? Ooh, that just
bites, doesn't it? So recently I had this experience. Now before we get too far into it, I just want to mention that the summer is coming, or is already here, really, among us. I'm putting out this little podcast here of just me, the talking head, because I love to do that from time to time. I do have a couple more interviews that I've recorded that'll be coming on down the pike. But I think for the summer, I'm going to relax on midlife crisis to a centered life thriving. Don't get too scared though. It doesn't mean I won't be dropping something every single week. I probably will, but I'm going to try a few different things. So just bear with me through the summer as I try a few different ways of doing podcasts. I might even try to do a live podcast. I know it's crazy, but I'm trying to get an idea for whether or not I can pull that off with all the software that I have, even when I might be traveling and not doing every podcast from my home as I usually do from my home office. So just bear with me. Those of you that are my loyal listeners, thank you so much. But I'm going to switch stuff up and I'm going to take a little break from necessarily doing big, long interviews for every single week, even though that is kind of the theme of season 2. It was how I ended season 1. So you shouldn't feel like you haven't had enough interviews and experts that I've brought on the podcast. I've brought some really heavy hitters this year, and you can certainly revisit those as well. By the way, if you're not on my email list, make sure that you go to learntoloveyourstory.com and you sign up for my freebie right there on the front page. Give me your email address. You'll be on my email list. And then each and every week, I send out not only links to the podcast that I've aired for that week, but sometimes links to other podcasts that are related to that, other blog posts I've written, other videos that I've recorded, all on subject matter that's related to whatever we talked about that week. So you're getting lots of little goodies every time. And sometimes I'll, do a free worksheet on self-care or self-awareness building or meditation or something like that, because we were talking about it during the week. And you'll miss out on all of that if you're not on my email list. So that only goes out to the people on the email list. Make sure that you are one of those people, because you don't want to miss out on any of that fun stuff. And as I do weird things through the summer, my guess is I'm going to be offering you a little bit more on the newsletter side, because I know that I'll be a little goofy on the podcast side. But all of it is, though, meant to give you the best of the best that I can, while still, honoring what I teach here. And I like to take time with my kiddos during the summer. They're only little once, right? So, well, one is 20 and one is 9. So they're not littles anymore, really, but I only get to, be here and doing those fun things. And I like to practice what I preach. So I wanted a little bit more flexibility this summer. And I know that sometimes that will mean just a little bit less content wise, and I won't have enough time to do the full editing of those interviews like I normally do. So I appreciate your grace for me during the summer months, but I promise something will get dropped every single Monday. That is for sure. All right. So let's go back to this subject. First of all, let me tell you the story. So I not only do, my own podcast, I have guested on several podcasts before, and I happened to be a guest on a podcast just recently. It hasn't aired yet. Again, if you're on my email list, you'll get information about when those all drop, when I've guested on somebody else's podcast. You don't hear about that on my podcast necessarily, but you will hear about it if you're on my email list in the newsletter that I send out weekly. So I was guesting on this podcast and I was sharing about my story, stuff that I've shared here on my podcast about my couple divorces and, how I've gotten through my own kind of midlife crisis myths and have started to live a centered life thriving in my midlife. Why that is so important to me, why that is a passion that I have just decided I wanted the world to know a little bit more about this information so that women don't feel so isolated, don't feel like you're the only one going through this stuff. So I was sharing about this, and the host made the comment, and this is not the first time I've heard this comment, made the comment, well, you're a psychologist. Shouldn't you have known better? And I felt that in my bones. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, every single time that happens, I just get stopped in my tracks. And I've done the work and I teach the work and I still get stopped in my tracks when somebody says that. So all kinds of shame, kind of just washed over me in that moment. It was really painful to listen to. It was really painful to hear that opinion. And my response, I think, was great. Like I went into exactly what I've taught you on the podcast and I'm going to talk about today, which is, yeah, sure. I mean, we're all human first, right? So we all will find ourselves in these patterns even when we know better. We get caught up in it. It's an old pattern. And, if we haven't done all of our work, or even if we're doing our work, sometimes there's just a piece of it that gets triggered and we don't realize till we're well into it that we were vulnerable enough and got well into it. So, essentially it's a reasonable question. You're a psychologist. Of all people, shouldn't you have like the best marriage? It'd be like asking, a marriage and family therapist, none of you get divorced, right? Well, but they do, right? Because we're all human. So it's like such an such an invalidating comment to make. And yet it's a pretty human thing to ask at the same time. Like you got to kind of hold space for both, but it does just wash over me in a way that can really stop me. And it started to stop me in that conversation. And I was able to recognize that. I had my mindfulness, about me, that my observer self was able to say, oh, Natalie, you're starting to go down this shame spiral. I noticed that some of my answers after that were a little bit shorter, almost as if like I didn't want to put out any more vulnerable information. And this is probably what you would experience if you indeed had somebody stop you in the middle of a conversation and say, well, shouldn't you have known better? So, I want to start by saying, on the side of us having this shame spiral, totally normal. And the name of the game is really to get grounded as fast as you can, is to recognize that's what's happening and that you're going into your shell, and to come from, a place of your most resourced adult self, if you can. That's what I call that in clinical psychology, is that most resourced adult self. And what that really means is like, I need to get grounded in the present moment, that it's 2024 and I do know better, and I did know better then. And I also have compassion that I got to be human then and made the mistake and found myself in a relationship that wasn't working for me. And so I made the really difficult decision, sometimes very courageous decision, to step away from that relationship because it's a mess to come through a divorce. And anybody who's been through it or around it knows that. So nobody chooses that lightly, right? And it isn't a mess up or a character flaw on my part. So I had to show up in that moment in compassion towards myself, kind of separate myself from that question and separate myself from my, other compensating behaviors that I might get into, over explaining why that happened, or, kind of taking the conversation in a different direction entirely because I was like, feeling a little sheepish about it. Mostly though, all I wanted to do was make sure that I got into that adult awareness again, that adult space where I have all the connections in my brain I need to the parts of me that know I'm a good person and I did the best I could then. And as soon as I knew better, I did better and made choices for myself to get out of that. And then that allows me space to hold compassion for the other person, which is the other half of it. So first, you kind of have compassion for yourself and get into a grounded space. And then you gotta know that we've all been programmed to believe that it's a character flaw if you go through a divorce. Like we've all been programmed to believe if you make a mistake and you know better, that you should have been able to prevent that from happening. This is not uncommon for people to come from that place, right? It's a righteous idea of things, but we've all socially been conditioned to believe when we must have a better character if we can see it coming ahead of time, right? That is not what that is, but I can have compassion that that host was programmed in the very same thing that was causing me to have a shame spiral in that moment. And I wanted to come on the podcast today just to kind of pull that apart and say, listen, this is not us against us. This is us against a system, right? One of the online courses that I have is called bucking the system. And the reason I call it that is I am teaching in that online course all of these unsaid rules that we follow our lives by and hold ourselves accountable to, but that really don't serve us, right? So it does not serve me to think that it was a character flaw and that I did something wrong, that I knew better than to go in a relationship with some red flags. And I could see them in hindsight, but I couldn't see them with foresight. And that was what I was talking about in that podcast. And also, it doesn't really serve me to have a podcast host also believe that it must be a character flaw for me. And what went down in that moment, what stopped me, and that I felt on a visceral level was that I had messed up. Like, oh my gosh, right. And this host is catching me at the fact that I messed that up early in my life and I could have known better, should have known better. And like, really what you're trying to recognize is, no, had I known better, I'd have done better. Right? If I had known better all of the ways in which I was getting sucked in and that it was getting sucked in and that it was something that was not going to benefit me to be in that relationship, well, then I would have done things differently, right? No, the best version of me at that time made those decisions and I trust that she did. I also know that she's grown into me and she will continue to grow into my future and keep making better decisions the more that I learn. But I need to let go of this programming that it is somehow a flaw of me when I fail forward in life. That is something I need to buck. I need to buck that system. And while I can have compassion for a host that asks that question or others that you get caught in a conversation and they're like, shouldn't you have known better than that? I also can show up to the programming and conditioning there and be assertive and say, no, in actuality, humans fail forward. And I believe that we're all doing the best that we can when we make the decisions we do based on, our state of mind and what we know in those moments. And once we know better, we can do better, right? And sometimes we have to fall and get back up and fall and get back up several times before it really locks in what we need to do differently. But I think that part of what eats at us in this scenario is that programming and conditioning that there's something wrong with you, the person, when you're doing that. When in actuality, this is a neurobiological fact that the way that we prune neurons and create a new neural pathway that knows a new thing is to fail and course correct and fail and course correct enough times that we get it, right? My daughter comes home with her math test and she's like, I got 13 out of 16. And she is so excited. And she's excited that maybe next time she won't get those 3 wrong. And that's how I want her to think about a 13 out of 16, not I didn't get it perfect. And so I suck, right? I don't want her to think that way. I want her to think in the way of, I learned so much that I got a 13 out of 16 and I have space to grow. And I wish that the programming and conditioning that the world gave all of us was something like that, but it doesn't, right? It tells us that we are somehow innately broken every time we make a mistake in our life, especially if, like all of the evidence in hindsight was there. But the problem is that it's hindsight. And there's an element in hindsight that is there that wasn't present at the time that the thing happened. That is the version of you today with all the knowledge and wisdom that she has. She didn't have it then. Had she had it then, she would have made a different decision. It's hindsight. It wasn't insight at the time of that happening. And so I need you to just hear that we have to reprogram ourselves into thinking that failing forward is a part of growth. It's a part of having a growth mindset, and that having some emotional agility and grace for ourselves around that is really key in having a centered life and thriving, and not shrouding away and shutting down and really feeling stopped in our tracks and stuck every time we did a wrong thing. And I think that this lesson is especially important during midlife because so much of what we're doing is trying new things and failing forward. So much of this whole experience that we're having right now is newness in our bodies as our hormones change at a late stage in life, and that, different organs take over that hormone production. And so our ability to manage stress completely is lowered. Period. End of sentence. You've heard me say this a million times, but I don't think it can be said enough. Like, your capacity for stress completely lowered in midlife. That is just part of the deal. Can't change biological facts. But if we're holding ourselves accountable to this programming and conditioning, this social idea that we're somehow wrong, broken, bad, if we're failing forward as we try new things out in our life, then we're going to be crippling ourselves. And that programming and conditioning has to get bucked during this stage of our life. We have to rewrite that narrative. My suggestion is to adopt this philosophy of always working towards excellence instead of perfection, right? Perfection will never be attained. It's actually non-attainable. No one's perfect. Humanity is inherently flawed. That's fine. But if you only give yourself credit if you're perfect and you're inherently flawed, you are set up in a recipe for always not liking who you are and always trying to be better and not feeling enough. So what if you adapted seeking excellence, that you always believe you're showing up in this moment the very best that you absolutely can, and you hope that tomorrow you can do better, and the next day better, and the next day better, that you're always seeking to go beyond that, but you're also celebrating that where you are is perfectly, wonderfully whole, right? Then there is space to buck the programming and conditioning that failure is a character flaw. Then instead, we can see it as part of the learning experience, right? It's like my daughter who comes home with a 13 out of 16 on her math test. Great! I got 13. Like, I'm really killing it here. And I have these 3 that I keep to go forward. I can keep working towards that excellence. Yay! That's what I want for myself, that I'm both proud of myself in the moment that I'm here and still seeking to be a better version and to keep growing and developing in my life, in midlife, right? I haven't arrived anywhere. And so much of my life is changing. My social, worth is changing according to these programs and conditions that society has pushed on me, like wrinkles are a bad thing, and collagen that's, faces that sag, bad thing, bodies that sag, bad thing, gray hair, not looking so nice, right? If I buy that, if I don't buck that system, then I am in that perfectionism trap, and I am trying to be young when I'm not young and believe that beauty is in the youngness, not in me. I need to adapt a different way. I need to shift into a different way of thinking and being in the world. And that being said, it's okay to still get caught in your old programming, which is what happened to me during that podcast. All that happened is that host made the comment, shouldn't you have known better? You're a psychologist. And I could feel inside me the old programming of perfectionism, like shaming me into believing that, yeah, of course, as I talk to you today, years later, in hindsight, of course, because today's me knows a different thing. But that version of me, she was showing up in her life every day. I promise you 100%. I have never been anything less than showing up 100% in my life. So I know I was making the best decision I knew how to with the information that I had at the time. I can't, from today's venue, be judging that earlier version of myself, and I won't. And I showed up on that podcast and said, like, no, we all are human and we're all still growing. So yes, I was a psychologist and I knew a lot of things, but had I known all the things that I know today, I could have made a different decision. But the version of me then, no. I 100% believe she was doing the very best she could at that time. And I want you to be bucking the systems in your life that are defeating you at this time in life. There's so much that feels like a threat and creates that idea of that feeling of crisis in our midlife. There are so many things changing in our bodies, outside of us, in our roles. Our parents are aging. We're having to step in. We're, at work doing things differently, seeing younger people, go beyond us faster and not know what to do with that, and maybe some of us are just getting sick of our jobs. You've been doing the same thing for a minute. And it's okay to itch to change. And you might want to look at school and you might want to look at doing something completely different. But if in the culture you're believing the programming and conditioning that you should have done that earlier, then you're going to blame yourself for not going to school sooner. And you're going to be mad at yourself about that. And that whole journey will feel awful, right? So that's like if it was a work related thing. Could be in our relationships that, we've settled and let ourselves be people pleasers for a long time. And we thought that our worth really came from being great caregivers and showing up in that way with every relationship that we had. And we're burning out because you can't just give and never give to yourself and do that selfless thing for so long. Like there is just a limit to what you're going to be able to do with that. So if we don't change that programming and conditioning in our mind, then it will defeat us over time. That's where the crisis will really start to set in because the ways in which we've showed up in the world, being a perfectionist, being selfless, always putting people before us is not going to work in midlife when our stress levels, we just don't have the capacity for taking all of that on. Not to mention that it doesn't work out the same. It doesn't have the same end as it used to when we had a little bit more margin with our youth and our energy levels, right? So I want you to just think about what happened to me during that podcast, how it really stopped me, how I used things like my mindfulness and looking at it like from my observer self to get myself grounded in that moment, took some breaths, recognized what was happening, decided, hey, I don't want to do this to myself. So I'm going to take a minute here. I'm going to give myself some credit that I believe I did the best I could at the time. And now I know different. And that's what I'm talking to this podcast host about. And I'm going to let that podcast host. And guess what? I shouldn't have known better. No, that isn't a great comment to make. We are all human. Even psychologists are human, right? And even with all the knowledge that I had, I wasn't able to have insight into all the pieces of that until I grew and knew better. And then once I did, that's the story I'm telling you, is of my growth and how I became resilient and came out of that on the other side. So I just want you to hear, like when you get stopped like that, there's ways to take a step back, observe yourself, and get connected to this new part of you that you're growing, that you're listening to Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving, to learn ways of looking at the world differently, of changing the rules because you get to. Because let's just say, if you've been on the earth this long, you at least get the privilege of deciding if those rules serve you. And if they don't, throw them out. There is nothing that says you have to follow those rules. Nothing. There's a lot of social pressure, family pressure, religious pressure, maybe, to follow those rules. But honestly, if you start shifting them, there isn't earthquakes, there aren't tsunamis, the world doesn't go down in a big hurricane. It's okay for you to decide that doesn't serve me to look at my life that way, and I'm going to show up to it differently. And I really hope that after listening to this podcast today that you're able to do that and step into your own power and live that centered life thriving. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these 2 crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME to 741-741 to the crisis text line. And you can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.